Toda rabba, Harvey, and thank you for the very generous introduction. Harvey has really been an exceptional mentor for me for many years, so I feel greatly honored that he introduced me today, and I feel really privileged and honored and excited by the invitation to speak at the opening of this meeting. The theme of this conference, The Long History of Jews from Muslim Countries in Israel, is such a fitting tribute to the importance of Yaron Sur's work in pushing the boundaries of research in the field, in broadening the discussion, thinking about comparative history, methodology, and theory. Yaron has helped pave the way to a new generation of research, and this, I think, is reflected in the many, both the subject and the many contributors to this conference. For me personally, Yaron's contribution to scholarship has been a great inspiration, and because I feel that Yaron's research has so closely paralleled my own, I want to offer some reflections about how the larger field of the study of Middle Eastern and North African Jews, and Morocco in particular, has developed. It is perhaps self-evident that the motivation for the study of the history of the Jews from Muslim-majority countries of the Middle East and North Africa stems from the fact that most settled in Israel and came to constitute half of the population of the country. That the history of these communities was worthy of attention, however, has not always been largely accepted in Israeli society as a whole, nor officially encouraged in educational institutions and academia. The very idea that Jews who came from Asia and Africa had a long history, the theme of this conference, runs contrary to dominant ideology that erases the diasporic past of the Jews deemed more backwards and who did not evolve in the same manner as European Jews. The result was in the first decades of the State of Israel, relatively little scholarship was produced on the modern history of the Jews of the Middle East and North Africa. Much more research was devoted to the Jews in the medieval Islamic world. But these studies, as important as they are, were detached from the Jews who actually inhabited the regions. Those who came to Israel from Muslim countries were like rejected heirs of the older legacy. Decades of research and writing on the modern and early modern history of Middle Eastern North African Jews has changed this picture to a large extent. But this scholarship, which is so well represented in this room today, has still not penetrated fully the public sector, nor is well integrated in Israeli academia and schools. The fact that the recent Biton report, whatever the political motivations behind the initiative, felt the need to define the Sephardi and Mizrahi heritage as separate and in need of integration into the curriculum is revealing. It shows the enduring public perception that Jews from Asia and Africa form a category apart with specific characteristics and distinctive territories assigned to the major immigrant groups. The coupling of Sephardi with Mizrahi, an ambivalent claim to inclusion in the larger Jewish world, often serves instead to disaggregate Oriental Sephardim from the Western Sephardim, lumping together the Jews of Islam in a single category, coded as Sephardi and Mizrahi, conceals a much more diversified and complicated set of circumstances that changes immensely between countries and regions. These, I believe, are problems influenced by political circumstances and societal pressures with which scholars have had to contend. This has been particularly acute for the study of Moroccan-Jewish history, since Moroccans in Israel stand out as the largest Jewish population of any country in the Middle East and North Africa. The attitude towards Moroccan Jews produced in the age of mass immigration to Israel was almost entirely negative. They were even compared unfavorably to other Mizrahim. Moroccan Jews were often singled out as the quintessential example of the backward Oriental Jew whose cultural background has prevented their assimilation in society. Scholarship on Mizrahim and on Moroccan Jews in particular began to develop in the 1970s. It was a response to the developing identity politics of ethnicity in Israel. Moroccan Jews began to assert greater pride in their background, and a new kind of identity, ironically of exile in Israel, began to develop. At the same time, a part of this identity politics involved associating one's community with the dominant historical narrative that shaped Israeli national identity, that Israel was born out of anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. For some Moroccan Jews, therefore, the idea that they as well suffered persecution, that the Holocaust was also part of their history, became a part of their identity as, or at least contested identity, as Moroccan Israelis. Yet this account of persecution was countered by another narrative. Morocco was different, indeed exceptional in the Muslim world, and that life there had been good. An exceptional aspect to this identity was the continued or renewed connection to Morocco. Visits to Morocco of Jews of Moroccan descent, often decades after their departure, was an important part of this. These visits were also legitimized by the development of relations between the Moroccan monarchy and Israel on various levels. The rediscovery of the monarchy in the Moroccan Jewish diaspora was one of the results, and a growing number of Moroccan Jews came to identify with Hassan II, who became king in 1961 after the death of Mohammed V. The connection was also promoted by a coterie of wealthy Moroccan Jewish businessmen who were very important in the development of the Moroccan economy and industry, and who were close to the palace and had strong connections to the political and economic elite in Israel, France, and other countries. These connections helped pave the way for Morocco playing an important role in brokering the peace agreement with Egypt in the 1970s and later in the 1980s, negotiations with the Palestinians. Oops. Oh, sorry. The fact that the Moroccan monarchy came to be regarded as a friend of the Jews gave legitimacy to the idea of Muslim-Jewish harmony in Morocco, which in turn is constitutive of a Moroccan-Israeli hyphenated identity. Hassan II promoted the idea of the continued importance of the Moroccan Jewish diaspora, their cultural heritage and loyalty to their country of origins. The promotion of Moroccan Jewish culture has become a cornerstone even of Moroccan foreign policy and is important in Morocco's tourist industry. This has resulted in increased scholarship as well as collaborative encounters between Israeli and Moroccan scholars and public figures, beginning, as I can remember, by a conference of the Moroccan Jewish group Identité et Dialogue held in Paris in 1978, where the attachment of Jews of Moroccan origin, wherever they might live, if I'm recalling correctly, was affirmed as a kind of timeless and inalienable identity. Morocco's ostensibly pro-Jewish policy, its acknowledgement that Jewish culture is an integral part of Morocco's historical legacy, is exceptional in the Muslim world. The idea is embraced by many Moroccan Muslim intellectuals and some of the educated elite. For even though few Jews remain in Morocco, their historical presence as now the only non-Muslim minority is a powerful symbol for those who advocate a more open and pluralistic society in the face of more intolerant trends. Most Moroccan Muslims, however, are ignorant of this state-sanctioned initiative. Among the vast majority who were born after the mass departure of Jews, many cannot even imagine that Jews are or were once indigenous to Morocco. Many are hostile to Jews who they see through the lens of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, drawing from ideas about the enmity of Jews to Islam. Thus, we see how Moroccan Muslims and Moroccan Jews both are, and their descendants of Moroccan Jews are ambivalent and divided about their relationship, both past and present. This ambivalence in Morocco, Israel, and throughout the Moroccan Jewish diaspora has shaped public discourse about Muslim-Jewish relations in history and memory, a pendulum that swings between a vision of harmonious coexistence and persecution. Though of opposite poles, both share in the common perception of Moroccan exceptionality, and this is reflected in much of the scholarship. I would like to focus then on three interrelated aspects of this. The first, Muslim-Jewish coexistence. The second, the Mellah. And the third, the monarchy. First, on Muslim-Jewish relations. They are not like our Arabs. Many perhaps have heard this from Moroccan Jews in Israel. They, in this common refrain among Moroccan Jews, refers to the Palestinian or Arabs in Israel. The stigma attached to being Jews of Arab culture, the presumed association to a population with which Israeli Jews are in conflict, is countered by the affirmation that Arab-Jewish relations were good in Morocco. This nostalgic remembering of the cordial relations that Jews maintain with their Muslim neighbors thus becomes a proud affirmation of one's Moroccan identity, of Moroccan exceptionality that contrasts with other parts of the Muslim world and that links the past with the more recent present of exclusion and discrimination that Jews from Morocco faced in Israel. The public revival of Mimouna as a celebration of Moroccan and Mizrahi ethnicity in the 1970s symbolized also the harmonious coexistence between Muslims and Jews in Morocco is one example of this. The celebration of Moroccanness in Israel can also be seen in conjunction with the development of heritage trips to Morocco of Moroccan Jews visiting their former homes, shrines, and sites of their ancestors, further strengthening their sense of being Moroccan. The return to Morocco, and I put return in quotation marks, also came in conjunction with the simultaneous development of pilgrimage to shrines in both Israel and Morocco, which strengthened ethnic ties in Israel and connections to Morocco and the larger Moroccan Jewish diaspora. During these visits, Moroccan Muslims often recounted nostalgically the time when Jews were ubiquitous in Morocco, especially in rural regions of the south. As I witnessed many times in interviews in Morocco in the late 1990s, Muslims bemoaned the departure of Jews, which they saw as creating a vacuum in the socio-economic landscape of the country. Mirroring the image of peaceful coexistence is the emphasis placed on anti-Semitism in Morocco. The inclusion of Moroccan Jews in the national narrative of anti-Semitism also legitimized the idea of the Moroccan Israeli by connecting them to the narrative of persecution common to all Jews, and this anti-Semitism led to the inevitability of emigration. The persecution narrative of Moroccan Jews has increased in Israel in recent years as successive governments of the right and their coalitions attempt to harness the ethnic vote. And here, ethnicity, especially referring to Mizrahim. This is reflected with what might be called the refugeization of Mizrahim by lumping together all Jews of Muslim countries into a single category, all refugees fleeing their place of origin because of persecution. And of course, as we know, this was enacted by the Knesset law of 2014, establishing November 30th as the day to mark the departure and expulsion of Jews from Arab countries and Iran. The official recognition of refugees is not only intended for maintaining and gaining the support of Mizrahim, but is also part of a larger political campaign to play the Mizrahi card as a counterweight against Palestinian claims of compensation and or return. It is in this context that a narrative of persecution has been created, from the Almohads de Moulay al-Yazid, from the Trito, referring to the sacking of the Mellah of Fez in 1912, to the Ujda massacre of 1948, life in Morocco for the Jews was grim. The Trito of 1912 referred to often as a pogrom, and according to a recent book on the subject, it's, and I'm quoting here, magnitude surpassed in horror the pogroms of Kishinev that occurred around the same era. The Trito is seen as the culmination of centuries of persecution, whose memory was a key factor in understanding the mass exodus of Moroccan Jews. The assimilation of the Moroccan story into the Ashkenazi narrative of endemic anti-Semitism, for example, the very use of the term pogrom, for example, thus serves to legitimize Moroccan-Israeli identity in the larger socio-political landscape of Israel. Okay, so the Mellah. The ambivalence of Muslim-Jewish relations, which alternates between memories of harmony and discord, is also expressed in the historical memory of the Mellah. The Mellah was one of the distinctive aspects of Jewish life in Morocco. Morocco was one of the few countries of the Muslim world where Jews were forced to live within the walled-in confines of a Jewish quarter. The term itself was derived from a distinct district in Fez, which became a place of compulsory residence of Jews in the 15th century, and later became the generic name for the Jewish quarter or the Jewry of a given locale in Morocco, regardless of whether or not there was a specific Jewish quarter. In Fez in the 15th century, Marrakesh in the 16th, Meknes in the late 17th, and in the principal coastal cities in the first decade of the 19th century, the Mellah became a walled-in and gated urban quarter where Jews were required to live. As the numbers of Jews increased in a given locale, the Mellah became densely populated. Since the 19th century, as urbanization caused overcrowding, foreign observers were often shocked at the poverty of the Mellah, sometimes denouncing the degradation of the Jews being, as observers saw it, locked up at night in the forced confines of the Jewish quarter and subject to the abuse of Muslims for those who had the temerity to venture outside its walls. These descriptions were in some cases projections of the European ghetto, magnifying the destitution and oppression of the Jews with familiar anti-Semitic stereotypes as a way to demonstrate European superiority. Drawing from these sources, both scholars and some Moroccan Jews paint a dark portrait of Jewish life in Morocco, even in an exceptional case in terms of its oppressive state. During the colonial era, Jews were no longer required to live in the Mellah, that is, in those cities which such restrictions were still in place. And many Jews with means moved to more spacious dwellings in the European neighborhoods, La Ville Nouvelle. In pre-colonial times, most of the Mellahs were home to both elite, with their network of ties and privileged social status, and the poor, microcosms of what Yaron Sur describes as sectional society. In the 20th century, the Mellahs became magnets for Jewish rural migrants who joined the ranks of the urban poor, renting their dwellings from Jewish landlords, some of whom formerly lived in the Mellahs. Descriptions in the 20th century depict the Mellahs as cesspools of poverty and disease, reinforcing the image of the exceptionally oppressive nature of Muslim society in Morocco. For other Moroccan Jews, decades after their departure, the Mellah became a symbol of the uniqueness of Moroccan Jewish life, a lost world that contrasts with the more desolate towns where Moroccan Jews came to inhabit in Israel's peripheries. The Mellah is described as a privileged place of refuge, protected by the benevolent monarchy. Rather than being a symbol of degradation and oppressive confinement, vulnerable to the pillaging of the Muslim mobs, as the Trito symbolizes, the Mellah, paradigmatically located next to the palace, as in the case of Fez, is a safe haven for Jews, an exceptional aspect of Jewish life in Muslim lands. The monarchy. During casual conversations I had with people during my stay this year in Israel, when they learned that I was interested in Moroccan Jews, they joked that every Moroccan they met worked for the king as cook, tailor, or jeweler. And probably you have some other professions also as well. The satire about Moroccan Jews and the monarchy, I realize, is condescending, for we live in an age when kings and queens are regarded as vestiges of the past. But for Moroccans, the emotional connection to the king is real. Once Moroccan Israelis recreated a connection with their country of origin, the veneration of the king was empowering against the background of their lower social status, even though in concrete terms, of course, the king had little control over their lives. Moroccan Jews are, once again, the exception of Jews from the Muslim world in their affinity to the rulers of their country of origin. The Moroccan monarchy is not only exceptional in its relationship to Jews, but is somewhat of an anomaly in the post-colonial world. Gaining control in Morocco in the latter half of the 17th century, The Alawids of Morocco were among the oldest dynasties in the world and among a very few that still wield significant political power. The Alawid rulers are regarded as sharifs, a title indicating descent from the Prophet Muhammad. They stake their claims as the rightful heirs to the universal caliphate of Sunni Islam, adopting the caliphal title of Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the faithful. The latest Moroccan constitution of 2011 reaffirmed the position of the king as Amir al-Mu'mineen, the supreme religious authority and protector of Islam and the religious community. It was the duty of the Islamic head of state to uphold the sacred law. This would include those under the contract of protection, the dhimma, established by the first Amir al-Mu'mineen, Umar ibn al-Khattab, in the 7th century. The largest Jewish community from where the Jewish leadership sprung in Morocco were in the major cities, where at different periods of history, royal authority was exercised. Jews played a particularly important role in the courts of rulers, a phenomenon common throughout the Jewish world, but in Sharifian Morocco, it was a quasi-institution, such that every sultan in Morocco had his Jewish courtiers on whom he depended for the conduct of trade and or diplomacy as key intermediaries between foreign merchants and powers and between regions and tribes within Morocco. As dhimmis, Jews were dependent on the protection of the ruling sultan, yet the Sharifian monarchy was also dependent on the services that Jews could provide in trade and diplomacy. For the monarchy, the use of Jews was advantageous over Muslims. With the latter, there was the constant risk of dissidents and amassing political and economic power, and this needed to be constantly neutralized in order to exercise authority and domination. It was thus in the interest of the ruler to privilege a Jewish elite, enabling them to gain wealth that in turn could bring resources to the ruling sultan and his entourage without the risk of that they would use their wealth or foreign ties to challenge the political authority of the ruling sultan. In the collective memory of the Moroccan Jewish community, the Alawid sultans were good for the Jews, ensuring their security and protecting them from the maltreatment of local Muslim authorities. However, what I would argue is the general veneration of the monarchy is of relatively recent derivation, projected anachronistically into the distant past. This theory is based on several factors. While Jewish leaders maintained close ties to the monarchy in those cities and those times when the Alawid rulers exercised authority, power in Morocco was diffuse, and Jewish leaders on behalf of their communities invested their loyalties in regional authorities and potentates who could best ensure their safety and well-being. That the Alawid dynasty would survive was certainly not self-evident. Until the 20th century, there really was no nation-state of Morocco as we know it today. Jews remained dhimmis, protected subjects of the Islamic ruler, while the notion of Moroccan subjects was established in the Madrid Convention of 1880 by the idea of perpetual allegiance. It was really about controlling the abuse of consular protection, the reason that the conference was held. It was only in the colonial period that this became the basis of Moroccan citizenship, in which Muslims and Jews became subjects of the monarchy. It's also the basis by which Jews of Moroccan descent in Israel can go and claim their Moroccan nationality to this day. Though the dynasty originated in the 17th century, the national monarchy was a product of 20th century colonialism. The first resident general of the French Protectorate, Hubert Lyautey, created the monarchy as a way to legitimize colonial rule. Lyautey's intention was to disempower the monarchy and the Moroccan government, the Makhzen, using their symbolic capital as instruments of French control. The traditional legal authority of both Jews and Muslims was undermined, while a new national bureaucracy was created with the nomenclature of Sharifian offices, the royal army, and so forth, thereby creating a power structure that enabled the French to rule Morocco once the entire country was brought under control in the 1930s. While the French authorities were successful in controlling the apparatus of the country through the military, the contrôleurs civils, police, administrators, and courts, they still needed the Sultan to legitimize their standing as a protectorate over a sovereign country, the ruler being the only figure who could claim the symbolic authority over all Morocco as the Islamic ruler with his indigenous subjects, both Muslims and Jews. Unwittingly, Lyautey had created the coercive structure, the military and what might be called the neo-Mahsan, that the authoritarian Alawid kingdom inherited and continues to control to this day. This brings me back to the question of the Jews' veneration of the monarchy. In the transition to colonial rule, the Jewish leadership understood very well that it was the French that wielded the power in the country, not the Sultan, despite the trappings of sovereignty that Lyautey had cultivated. The fact that the Jews remained indigenous subjects of the Sultan and thus under the authority of the Mahsan was a source of frustration for the Jewish leadership, who naturally looked towards the French for the improvement of their status. The disempowered monarch, cloistered in the palace, hardly registered for the Jews in the first 2 decades of colonial rule. The accession in 1927 of Mohammed ben Yusuf, later known as King Mohammed V, went almost unnoticed by the Moroccan-Jewish community. Even the formulaic praise reserved for his Sharifian majesty appears to have been absent from public discourse in the Jewish communities in the early days of the Protectorate. But this was to change. In the 1930s, the Sultan emerged as a national figurehead, promoted by the incipient nationalist movement in creating the Throne Day celebration that marked the Sultan's accession to the throne. Kept as indigenous subjects of the Sultan by the French, who rejected their appeals to change their status, the Jewish leadership began to renew ties, at least on a symbolic level, to the monarchy. Given the uncertainties of the future in the 1930s, a time of growing political turmoil with clashes between the nationalists and the French authorities, Jews were hedging their bets. The French Protectorate authorities' effort to crush the nationalists, in part by enhancing the visibility of the Sultan and the traditional elites that they could use as a foil, was in the short term effective, but in the long term served to increase the prestige of the Sultan, who gradually used his position bestowed upon him by the French authorities to protest and eventually overthrow colonial rule. For the population, caught up in the tumultuous events of the 1930s, World War II, and the post-war struggles, it was far from certain that the monarchy would remain. Furthermore, the growing influence of the monarchy was not a linear process, but rather subject to both external and internal factors that affected the relative strength or weakness of French rule. Jewish leaders in Morocco thus responded to this ebb and flow of royal influence, turning to the Sultan when the position of the French authorities appeared to be weakened, such as during World War II, when the Protectorate authorities, de facto a part of the Vichy government, implemented anti-Semitic laws, or following the return of Mohammed V from exile and the transition to independence as Jews were positioning themselves as Moroccan citizens in the independent Moroccan state. The majority of Jews in Morocco, however, decided, whether by choice or force of circumstances, to emigrate. The patriotism expressed by Jews who remained in Morocco towards King Mohammed V was hardly in evidence among those who left in the 1950s. Among the mass of Jews, there was little sense of belonging to the emerging kingdom. We should also be reminded that it was only in the twilight of the colonial era, in the period that followed World War II, that an effort was made to create a representative national structure for Moroccan Jews as a whole. But the new institutions created did not instill in the communities as a whole a sense of being Moroccan. Moroccan Jewry was an invention of French colonialism as a structure and institution, at least, but as an identity, it really only reached its full fruition as a diaspora. Again, as Yaron Sur has brilliantly analyzed in his Kihila Keruah on the eve of independence, the Jewish community and their leadership were divided between different ideological tendencies, cultural orientations, and groups. For those Jews who remained in Morocco, Mohammed V was a crucial link between the past and present, ensuring the place of Jews in the post-colonial state. For unlike the Istiqlal, the main political party of independence, which was deeply divided about including Jews in the nation, especially because of its close ideological connection to the pan-Arab and pan-Islamic ideology, The king's good intention and protective role towards the Jews was unquestioned. The apocryphal story of Mohammed V protecting the Jews during the dark days of Vichy became a powerful symbol of the Sultan's unwavering support of his Jewish subjects. For the majority of Moroccan Jews who left Morocco, the rediscovery of the monarchy occurred nearly 2 decades after Moroccan independence, when Moroccan Jews began to reconnect to Morocco as part of their ethnic identity, as I talked about earlier, embraced and promoted by the Moroccan Jewish leadership and the monarchy itself under Hassan II. The story of the valiant and courageous role that Mohammed V played in protecting the Jews during World War II was thus reborn and rapidly spread in the Moroccan Jewish diaspora. The celebration of an Arab and Muslim king for defending the Jews is certainly one of the exceptional aspects in Moroccan Jewish history that has no other parallel in the Arab world, where Holocaust denial is not uncommon. But the story of Mohammed V's exceptionality during the Holocaust brings up 2 contradictory tendencies. For some, the king's heroism during the war is a source of pride, underscoring how Morocco was exceptional against a bleaker landscape of hostility towards the Jews in the Muslim world. For others who cast doubt on Mohammed V's role during the war, the story does not tally with the account of suffering, and thus the inclusion of Moroccans in the larger Holocaust narrative of catastrophe and redemption in Israel, the ultimate explanation for the mass migration to Israel. Moroccan Jewish history is thus not exceptional at all, but part of the larger Jewish narrative of persecution, Holocaust, and freedom. In conclusion, my purpose is not to judge whether or not Muslim-Jewish relations in Morocco were good or bad, but rather to offer some reflections on how and why the question is being asked. Both accounts, Morocco as a haven for Jews, Muslims as a place of, or I should say, both accounts, Morocco as a haven for Jews, and the other, Morocco as a place of persecution, mirror each other. 2 contrasting images that share in the common goal of defining what it means to be Moroccan. Thank you.